May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Goog Audio podcast. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, free from economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the limitations of the universal precept of do as little harm as possible. So today we have another piece from the collection of candidates for Tassajara Stories, the early years with Shunryu Suzuki. So this one is called Jerome. We were short on cups for the coffee and tea area and for the guest dining room. I was going through the whole place looking for them, mainly student rooms, next to last room on the right. In the dorm above the dining room was Jerome's. I knocked. No answer. Opened the door. Oh my, what a mess. And Bonanza, 3 cups. Jerome, what a contrast his room was to how he took care of what was outside of it. 9 rooms up there. We'd take turns cleaning the washroom, but didn't need to do the hall and porch, the steps, or the area in front. Jerome did that every day. No one else had a mess in their room. I was living in the next room to his and noticed how he opened and shut the door quickly. I think he liked it that way. When I first was around the Zen Center, Jerome was already a fixture at the scene, a quiet one. I'd walk there in the early morning darkness, and he'd be standing reading a paperback in the Bush and Laguna corner entryway alcove to the Toyo market under a light that always shone at night, waiting for the door to Sokoji to open. Almost everyone took their sandals off before entering the zendo. Jerome untied the strings of his shiny black shoes and put them on the rack. One morning I had to leave before service. He asked if I could drive him home. Sure. Turned out he lived at the little Crown Hotel right by the Mission Dolores. He managed it, too, had since 1962, the year he arrived in San Francisco and found the Zen Center. Started working at 7 in the morning. As an eager new student, I naturally asked him about Suzuki and Zen Center and Zen. He sure wasn't trying to encourage me. He said he'd watch people come and go, that after 2 years, 90% would leave. There wasn't enough there to keep their interest. That was a bummer. I asked him why he stayed, and he said there was enough there to hold his interest. Said he felt at home as soon as he arrived, and Della and Betty were there handing out apples at the door, apples that were gifts from a farmer in the Japanese-American congregation. He said that he felt more comfortable doing zazen than anything he'd ever done, that it just seemed natural. He'd always been quiet, just came and went from Sokoji without a word. But he was easy to talk with, no airs, was direct. I asked if he had any advice for me as a new student. Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, he said. What's Buddha? Big mind. What's Dharma? Look into it. Okay, can you tell me anything about Suzuki Roshi? He said Suzuki was into graphology, that he had people write their name down in a book when they came to Dokusan. I asked, don't you just think he was trying to remember their names? He wanted to see what their writing looked like. So what's his teaching? Beginner's mind. Anything else? Stick around. Come on, or I'll stop the car. Well, okay. I'm a prisoner. At first, Suzuki seemed just like a regular person, nothing out of the ordinary. And now, I asked, he's not pretentious. Neither was Jerome. Jerome was another Minnesotan, tall, gangly, awkward at times, and would periodically grimace and stretch his arms out like Ed Norton on The Honeymooners. I saw some little kids in the Lily Alley behind the city center run away when they saw Jerome coming toward them. I called him Zen Center's Frankenstein. He was a misfit who didn't feel at home anywhere till he came to Zen Center. Even in Zen Center, he was eccentric and somewhat discriminated against in subtle ways, as happens in any group. He'd lumber slowly with food stains on his robes, but showed up on time. In 1970, Jerome finally made it to live at Tassajara. The next year, he was the librarian. He'd been a librarian in El Paso before going out wester. He helped newer students figure out what to read, was most generous with his time. His matter-of-fact way of speaking and lack of pomp was endearing. He'd not tried to be particularly close to Suzuki. He didn't have that hungry, driven vibe a lot of people have. In the library one day, I reminded him what he'd said back in '66 about how people come and go, and said there's a lot of them staying now. Tassajara, he said. And then the city center, I added. You said there wasn't enough for them to get involved with. Now there's lots. Hippies and Baker, he said, meaning all the young seekers coming to San Francisco, and then Baker making Tassajara happen. Baker with a little help from his friends, I said. He was in Japan when the Page Street building was bought. He got the ball rolling, Jerome said. I told him some of the oldest students bemoaned the loss of intimacy with Zen Center's expansion. They missed the days when they could have breakfast with Suzuki and Oaksan. Claude felt betrayed. Suzuki himself said Zen Center had gotten too big. Jerome said he started saying that when we got the new building in '69. I asked him how he felt about losing the good old days. When they're gone, you continue without them. Another time I asked him, what's it all about, Jerome? Jerome said, I have a peculiar way of looking at Buddhism. It's the development of identity on a personal basis. Whatever your identity is, it's never solved, but always there. You're always seeking. Some people don't know this, but that's what you're really trying to do. Never heard it said that way. Who am I is the original koan going back in India, where there were gurus who said just to keep asking, who am I? And looking closely. One thing that Jerome had in common with most people at Tassajara, he loved ice cream. He even brought ice cream into ceremonies, not the kind that can be eaten, but the kind that can be referred to. Two of Jerome's offerings during Shosan ceremonies invoked ice cream. At one, Jerome, in his deep, projecting voice, called out, 28 flavors and no satisfaction. Richard Baker responded, go to Japan. Jerome did so later, got along well, and surely discovered the many, many flavors of ice cream and everything else in that realm. In Richard Baker's first priest ordination ceremony, Jerome had been second in line behind Yvonne, who had arrived 5 years after him. I always wondered if he'd noticed the little sighs he'd get like that. The worst I saw was at the Tassajara Ashes ceremony for Suzuki at the Hogback. Students crowded around that small space into the surrounding trees, slope, and trail, more than I'd ever seen up there. Many came from the city and around. As the Heart Sutra was chanted, Suzuki's disciples, those who'd been ordained as priests by him, stood in line to offer incense and place his ashes and bone bits with chopsticks into a hole in front of the great marbled stone. Bill Kwong, the earliest of them all, who'd been working on transmission with Suzuki when he died, gently asked renegade Philip Wilson, the earliest of the group to be ordained, to please remove his cowboy hat. Only Bill could have moved him to do that. That was cool. But when someone told Jerome he shouldn't be in that line, it pained me to watch him step back into the crowd. But did it pain him? Maybe for a bit. But more than anyone, in his actions, I could see no clinging to seniority and status. I'd go in for Shuso ceremonies where former head monks are invited to attend. Jerome's Shuso ceremony in 1976 was most impressive. More than that, when Jerome sat on the head monk's seat in the Shuso ceremony, holding the ceremonial staff that day, he was totally comfortable, poised, at ease, and he batted the students' questions back at them instantly, profoundly, humorously, effortlessly, like ping-pong balls, only they landed like bowling balls. One student was missing afterwards and later said his mind was so blown that he just went off by himself for a few hours to process what he just experienced. Jerome owned that day, and he did so without pride, arrogance, or trying to hold on to anything. During Richard Baker's first practice period as abbot, Jerome was his anja. Baker, who'd lived in Japan for 3 years, suggested to Jerome he might want to go to Japan someday. Jerome said he liked the matcha ice cream you could get in Japantown, so he might like Japan. On the 7th day of the session of the end of that practice period, they stayed up all night sitting. The Shosan ceremony happened the next day. The mood during that ceremony was intense. People were tired from being up all night, but energized by the 7 days of sitting they'd just been through. There was an element of confrontation in the back and forth. Baker didn't let things slide. The last person to ask a question was Jerome, who with typical detachment said, "Oh, Roshi, would you like a big matcha snow cone now?" Baker grimly with a touch of exasperation, "Jerome, what are we here for?" Jerome softly, "Buddha." Baker, "Say it again." A little louder, "Buddha." Baker, louder, "Buddha." Pat Phelan says that at that moment, the force of these two personalities meeting ignited the room, and everyone was laughing, crying, and cheering. It was cathartic, she said. This has been a Cuke Audio Podcast, another Tassajara story. I'm DC, Poobah of Cuke Archives and Puke Audio. Coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. And we're wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.